The sun had just started to rise, painting the sky with soft orange and pink colors. The parking lot of the small roadside motel was still quiet. Room 12's door creaked open slowly. A woman stepped out first. Her shoulders were hunched like she had not slept at all. Behind her came a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, dragging a backpack that looked too big for him. The woman kept glancing around like she was in a hurry but didn't want anyone to notice. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and her clothes looked wrinkled, like she had worn them for days. The boy didn't say anything. He just followed her with tired eyes, one hand clutching the strap of his backpack, the other rubbing his nose. They didn't go to the front desk to check out. Instead, the woman dropped the motel room key into the metal box near the office window. It made a soft clink as it hit the bottom. She didn't look back. She grabbed the boy's hand and walked fast toward a dusty old car with out-of-state plates. They got in quickly. The engine started with a loud cough, then settled into a rough hum. The car pulled out of the lot slowly, turned onto the road, and disappeared behind a row of trees. Inside the motel office, the morning clerk, a young guy with earbuds in, barely looked up. He didn't notice anything strange. To him, it was just another guest leaving early. About 10 minutes later, Marta, the housekeeper, arrived for her shift. She was in her late 50s, short, and always wore her uniform neat and clean. She greeted the clerk with a nod and headed to the supply closet to grab her cleaning cart. She had cleaned the rooms at this motel for over 15 years. She had seen a lot, loud fights, broken furniture, strange smells, but she always did her job without fuss. Her first room of the day was number 12. She pushed her cart slowly down the narrow outdoor walkway. The sun was climbing higher now, warming the walls. Birds chirped from the nearby trees. Marta reached the door and paused. Something felt off. She couldn't explain it. She had cleaned this room 100 times before, but today it felt heavy, quiet, like the air itself was waiting for something. She shook her head, laughed at herself softly, and opened the door. The room looked normal at first glance. The bed was unmade. A few paper cups sat on the table. The trash bin was half full. The air smelled like old pizza and cheap soap. Nothing unusual. Still, Marta stood in the doorway, not moving. Her eyes scanned the room slowly, taking in every detail. A towel on the floor. The chair pushed away from the table. The edge of the comforter folded strangely. She didn't know why, but her chest felt tight. Her hand went to her heart. Just nerves, she thought. Maybe too much coffee. But something inside her whispered, check the bed. Marta stepped into the room and shut the door quietly behind her. The usual cleaning routine played in her mind as she began to gather up the used towels from the bathroom. She could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit in the corner, but it wasn't loud enough to cover the small, unsettling silence that had settled over the room. As she walked toward the bed, her eyes caught the edge of the comforter. It was bunched up in a strange way, as if someone had hurriedly thrown it over something. The way the sheets were folded didn't look right, not like the way people usually left beds in a hurry. It was more like someone had tried to hide something quickly and just tossed the blanket over it. Marta's heart skipped a beat. She knew she shouldn't be snooping, but something tugged at her, something in her gut telling her to check. She took a deep breath and with a hesitant hand, reached for the edge of the blanket. The room felt colder, as if the air itself was waiting for her to pull the sheets away. She lifted the corner of the blanket, her fingers trembling slightly. As she pulled the covers back, her eyes widened. Underneath, wrapped tightly in a hotel towel, was something small. Too small, too still. It was a bundle, a shape too soft and round to be anything else. Marta froze for a second, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at it, unsure of what she was seeing. Her first thought was that it was some kind of toy, maybe a doll left behind by the guests. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw something that made her heart race. The bundle was moving. Barely, but it was. It shifted ever so slightly. A little gasp escaped Marta's lips before she could stop it. The towel was wrapped so tightly around whatever was inside, and she couldn't make out any details, but it was alive. Without thinking, Marta pulled the towel away, and her hands trembled as she uncovered the tiny face of a baby. The skin was pale, the lips blue, and the baby was completely still, its tiny chest barely rising and falling. Marta's blood ran cold. She felt like the world had gone completely still around her. The baby was so small, too small, like it wasn't meant to be alone. The towel had been wrapped around it so tightly that it looked like it had been hidden for a long time. In a panic, Marta rushed toward the phone on the nightstand. Her fingers fumbled as she dialed the emergency number, her mind a blur. When the operator answered, Marta barely managed to speak through her shock. "There's a baby," she said, her voice trembling. It's in the room, alone. I don't know what happened." The operator's voice was calm, but it only made Marta more anxious. She could hear sirens in the background, and the operator reassured her help was on the way. Marta felt like she couldn't breathe as she knelt beside the baby, looking down at its tiny form, her mind racing with questions. Why would someone leave a baby like this? How could anyone do this? She stayed with the baby, waiting for help to arrive, her hands shaking, but her mind focused. Everything around her felt distant, like she was in a dream. She couldn't believe what she had just found, but she knew one thing for sure: the baby needed help, and fast. Marta knelt beside the tiny baby, feeling the weight of the situation. Her mind raced, but she tried to stay calm. The baby was so small, fragile, and so very still. She couldn't stop thinking how close the child was to not making it. Every second felt like it mattered. She reached out gently, brushing her hand across the baby's cold skin. The baby's tiny chest barely moved, and Marta's heart sank even lower. She looked around the room, feeling the silence press in on her. The bed was still a mess, the towel still lying crumpled on the floor beside her. The smell of stale air and old sheets filled her nose. But it all seemed so distant. None of it mattered anymore. All she cared about now was the baby. As she waited for the paramedics, Marta couldn't shake the question running through her mind. Who would leave a baby in a room like this? Who would just walk away and leave something so helpless behind? She knew the guests had checked out quickly, but could they really have just left the baby like this on purpose? The longer she stared at the baby, the more she realized just how wrong everything felt. The towels were wrapped so tightly around the tiny body, it was clear someone had tried to hide it. The baby was clearly neglected, and the thought of what might have happened to it before it was left in that motel room made Marta's stomach twist in knots. She stood up suddenly, pacing around the room. Her nerves were all over the place. The silence around her felt too heavy, too still. She couldn't sit there any longer. She picked up the phone again, and this time her hands were steady as she spoke to the operator once more. "Please hurry," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "It's a baby. It needs help now." The operator, as calm as ever, assured her that the emergency response team was on the way and that they would be there in just a few minutes. The seconds dragged by as Marta returned to the baby, kneeling once more by its side. She could see the faint rise and fall of its chest, so small, so fragile, and it made her heart ache. She couldn't just stand there doing nothing. She had to do something. Marta remembered the first aid training she had received years ago. She wasn't a doctor, but she knew enough to help. She gently placed her hand on the baby's chest, checking for any signs of distress. She could feel the faint pulse, a tiny beat against her fingertips. Relief washed over her for a moment. At least the baby was alive, even if barely. She kept talking to the baby softly, her voice a quiet comfort. She wasn't sure if the baby could hear her or understand, but she wanted it to know that someone was there. She wasn't going to leave it alone, not like this. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of sirens broke through the heavy silence. Marta rushed to the window, her heart lifting as the ambulance pulled into the parking lot. The emergency responders jumped out of the vehicle and rushed toward the room. The paramedics were quick, their training kicking in as they examined the baby, making sure it was stable enough to be taken to the hospital. One of the paramedics looked up at Marta, giving her a reassuring nod. "You did the right thing," he said. "This baby's lucky you were here." Marta could barely process the words. She just nodded, watching as they carefully placed the baby into an incubator and wheeled it out of the room. She felt a strange mix of relief and worry. The baby was going to be okay, but what would happen to it now? As the paramedics drove off, Marta stood there, staring at the empty room. The weight of everything still hung in the air. and she couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had left the baby behind. She didn't know the full story, but she knew one thing for sure. Someone had been in a desperate situation. The ambulance sped away, its siren cutting through the quiet morning. Marta stood still, her mind still reeling from what had just happened. She knew the baby was in good hands now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just been part of something bigger than herself. There were so many questions racing through her head. Who was the baby's mother? Why had she left it behind? The sounds of the motel, the hum of the air conditioning, the distant chatter of guests moving around all felt too loud now. It was like the world had shifted into a different place. She felt detached, like she was still inside the room, even though it was empty now. Everything in the room had been carefully cleaned and arranged again, but it couldn't change what had happened. Marta slowly walked back to the office, where the young clerk was still fiddling with his phone. He didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary, his eyes glued to the screen. It wasn't that he was doing anything wrong. It was just that he had no idea about what had happened just a few rooms down. She didn't feel like talking, but she still had to let someone know what had happened. She pulled open the office door and looked at the clerk. He looked up at her, raising an eyebrow. He had no idea what she had just been through. "Is everything all right with room 12?" he asked, a little too casually. Marta swallowed. She was still trying to process everything, trying to make sense of the chaos. She didn't want to break the news to him, but there was no choice. "Someone left a baby in that room," she said quietly, her voice shaky. It was almost too late. The clerk's eyes widened, his face going pale. He quickly set down his phone and stood up. "Wait, what? A baby? You're serious?" "Yes," Marta replied. "I found it wrapped in a towel alone. I called for help. The paramedics took it to the hospital." The clerk didn't say anything for a long moment. His mouth opened and closed, as if he were trying to understand what she had just said. That's horrible," he finally whispered. Marta nodded. She wasn't expecting sympathy, but it still felt strange to talk about it out loud. Her hands were shaking again, but she knew she had done the right thing. The baby was safe now, and that was what mattered. But there was still so much more to figure out. "We need to call the police," she said, her voice firm now. "Someone needs to find out who left that baby." "Yeah, absolutely," the clerk agreed, his face suddenly serious. "I'll call them right now." Marta gave a short nod, then turned and walked back to the cleaning closet. She wasn't ready to talk more about what had happened. She just wanted to focus on getting her work done and not think about what she had seen. But it was hard to push it away. The image of the baby's small, fragile body kept flashing in her mind. As she began to prepare for the next room, her thoughts wandered back to the woman who had left the baby. What kind of person would do something like that? Had she been desperate? Was she scared? Marta didn't have answers, but she hoped the police would find them. The mystery wasn't over, but at least the baby was safe. For now, that had to be enough. After Marta finished her shift, she couldn't shake the image of the baby from her mind. The small, fragile body wrapped in a towel still haunted her thoughts. She kept wondering about the baby's mother. Who was she? Why had she left her child behind? The questions gnawed at her, making it hard to focus on anything else. The police had arrived shortly after she left the office, but Marta hadn't stayed to talk to them. She knew she had done all she could for the baby, and now it was up to them to figure out the rest. Still, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of responsibility. What if the police didn't find out who had left the baby? What if they couldn't track down the mother? Marta didn't want the baby to be forgotten, like so many other people in the world seemed to be. The next few days at the motel felt unusually quiet. Guests came and went, but there was a tension in the air that wasn't there before. People kept talking about the baby, gossiping about who could have done such a thing. Marta overheard bits and pieces of conversations as she cleaned rooms. Some guests were sympathetic, others were angry, but no one knew who had left the child behind. The police had come to the motel to ask questions, but they didn't find anything useful. The woman who had checked out of room 12 had used cash to pay for the night, and there was no record of her name. The license plate number of the car she had driven was also a dead end. It wasn't registered to anyone, and it seemed like the vehicle had been stolen. Marta found herself thinking about the woman. She wondered what had pushed her to abandon her baby. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she had no other choice. Marta couldn't help but feel sorry for her, even though she didn't understand her actions. But she also felt angry. How could anyone leave a baby like that? It wasn't long before the police began to piece together a few more clues. They traced the stolen car back to a woman living in a nearby town. Her name was Sarah, and she had a history of trouble. She had been in and out of shelters, and there were whispers about her being involved with the wrong people. But no one had seen her for a few days, and the police couldn't find her. Marta heard the news from one of the officers who stopped by the motel. They had no leads on where Sarah was, but they were getting closer. Marta felt a mix of relief and worry. If Sarah was the mother, she was in trouble, but at least they were getting closer to finding out the truth. As the days passed, Marta found herself hoping that Sarah would be found. She wanted the baby to have answers. She wanted the baby to know who their mother was. Even if it wasn't a happy story, the baby deserved to know. One afternoon, Marta was cleaning the lobby when a woman entered the motel. She had a nervous look on her face, and her eyes kept darting around. She didn't seem to notice Marta at first, but when their eyes met, the woman froze. Marta's heart skipped a beat. There was something familiar about her. "Can I help you?" Marta asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman's lips trembled. "I'm looking for my baby," she said quietly. I need to find my baby." Marta felt her breath catch in her throat. She had not expected this. The woman standing in front of her looked nervous, but there was something else in her eyes, something desperate. Marta's mind raced. Could this be the mother? The woman who had left the baby behind? She hadn't seen her face clearly before, but something about the woman's energy seemed to match the emotions Marta had felt when she first found the baby. Are you looking for your child?" Marta asked, her voice soft. The woman nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes, I've been looking everywhere for her. Please, tell me you've seen her." Marta hesitated, unsure of what to say. The police hadn't confirmed anything yet, but she knew this could be the woman they were looking for. I think I know where she is. But you need to tell me something first. Are you her mother?" The woman's face twisted with emotion. She nodded quickly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes, I'm Sarah. She's my daughter." Marta felt a strange mix of relief and concern. So this was the mother. But why had she left the baby in the motel? Why had she done something so reckless? Why? Marta found herself asking. Why did you leave her alone? Sarah looked down at the floor, her hands shaking. "I didn't mean to. I never wanted to leave her. But things were bad, really bad. I was scared, Marta. I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe someone else could help her, take care of her better than I could." Marta's heart ached as she listened. She could see the pain in Sarah's eyes, the weight of her choices. It was clear that Sarah hadn't abandoned her daughter out of malice. She had been in a desperate situation, and her decision had come from a place of fear and hopelessness. "Where is she?" Sarah asked urgently, stepping closer. "Is she okay? Please, tell me she's okay." Marta took a deep breath. She had to stay calm. "She's at the hospital. The paramedics took her there. She's safe now." Sarah's face softened with relief, but her anxiety didn't fade. "Can I go see her? Please, I need to see her." "Yes," Marta said, "but you need to speak to the police first. They've been looking for you." Sarah nodded, her hands shaking as she wiped her eyes. I know. I didn't know where else to go. I didn't think anyone would believe me." Marta felt a wave of sympathy for the woman. Sarah had made a terrible decision, but it wasn't because she didn't love her child. It was clear that Sarah wanted to do right by her daughter, even if her actions had been misguided. Marta could see the pain in her eyes, the struggle to make sense of everything. "Come on," Marta said gently. "Let's go to the police. I'll go with you." They walked together to the police station, Sarah's steps slow and heavy. Marta stayed close, offering her silent support. When they arrived, the officers recognized Sarah immediately. They took her in for questioning, but the tension in the room was different now. It wasn't just about finding the woman who had abandoned her baby anymore. Now it was about understanding why and giving Sarah a chance to explain herself. Marta waited outside, her thoughts racing. She knew this was far from over. There was still so much to figure out. But for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could work out for the baby after all. The police station was quieter than Marta expected. She sat in the waiting area, her fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. She hadn't seen Sarah come out yet, and the longer she waited, the more anxious she became. She couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was far from over. Sarah was clearly upset, and Marta could see how much pain she was in, but Marta also knew there were still so many unanswered questions. The officers had taken Sarah in for questioning, and Marta didn't know what they had asked her or how much information they had gotten. But she hoped they could figure out what had led Sarah to make such a desperate decision. She kept thinking about the baby, about how close it had been to not making it. She couldn't imagine what would have happened if she hadn't found her in time. After what felt like hours, the door to the back office opened, and Sarah walked out. She looked tired, her eyes red from crying. Her shoulders were slumped, and she moved slowly, almost like she was unsure of where to go next. Sarah. Marta stood up quickly, relieved to see her, but also concerned. How did it go? Sarah looked at her with a mixture of guilt and relief. It's complicated. The police are giving me a chance to explain. They know I didn't mean to hurt her. They're going to let me see her once they're done with the paperwork. Marta let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. I'm glad they're giving you a chance. Yeah, Sarah whispered, but it's not going to be easy. I'm not sure what's going to happen next. They sat together for a while, neither of them speaking much. Marta wasn't sure what to say. She didn't want to push Sarah too hard. She knew Sarah was going through a lot right now, and she had already shared so much. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, an officer came out from the back and approached them. He was the same officer who had spoken to Marta before. Marta, he said, his voice calm. We finished the questioning. Sarah's story checks out. She's been through a lot, but she's not a danger to her child. Marta nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't over yet, but this was a step in the right direction. Sarah wasn't a criminal. She wasn't someone who had intentionally hurt her baby. She had been scared, and in her fear, she had made a mistake. Thank you, Sarah said quietly to the officer. I never wanted to hurt her. I love her more than anything. I just didn't know what else to do. The officer nodded. We understand. Right now, we'll arrange for you to see her, but we'll need to follow up with you and make sure everything's in order before anything else happens. We want to make sure she's in a safe environment. I understand, Sarah said, her voice shaky. I'll do whatever it takes. I just want her back. The officer nodded and turned to leave. We'll be in touch soon. Hang in there. Sarah let out a long sigh and looked at Marta. Thank you for believing in me. I didn't know where else to turn. Marta smiled softly. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do after. They stood together in silence for a moment, both of them deep in thought. Marta knew there was still a long road ahead, but she felt a sense of peace knowing that Sarah wasn't a villain. She was just a mother who had made a terrible decision in a moment of fear. Marta hoped that this would be the first step toward healing for both Sarah and her baby. Days passed and Sarah stayed in contact with the police. They kept her updated on the baby's condition and continued to check on her progress. Marta knew Sarah was doing her best to follow all the rules to prove that she was ready to care for her child. It wasn't going to be easy, but Marta could see that Sarah was determined. She didn't give up. It was a week before Sarah was finally allowed to visit her daughter at the hospital. Marta didn't go with her, but she stayed in touch. She knew how important this moment was for Sarah. The police had made sure that everything was in place before allowing the visit. Sarah would be monitored closely, and she would need to show that she could provide a safe home for her child. Marta kept working at the motel, but her thoughts often wandered back to Sarah and the baby. She would hear bits of news from Sarah, who would sometimes call her to talk. Each time, Sarah sounded more hopeful. She was getting closer to bringing her baby home. Finally, one afternoon, Sarah called Marta with the news. I'm bringing her home, she said, her voice full of emotion. The baby's healthy. I've got a place to stay, and I'm getting everything ready. I'm so happy, Marta. I can't believe it's really happening. Marta's heart swelled with happiness for Sarah. It had been a long, difficult journey, but it seemed like things were finally falling into place. I'm so happy for you, Marta said, her voice shaking with joy. You've worked so hard, Sarah. You deserve this. Thank you, Sarah whispered. I couldn't have done it without your help. You saved my daughter's life. I'll never forget that. Marta felt a rush of warmth. She wasn't sure if she had done anything special, but just hearing Sarah's words made her feel proud. She hadn't known how much she could help someone until this moment. Helping Sarah had made her feel like she was part of something important. A few days later, Sarah invited Marta to visit her and the baby at her new apartment. It was small, but it was clean and cozy, a perfect place for a fresh start. The baby was asleep in a crib by the window, her tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Sarah was sitting next to her, smiling as she watched her daughter sleep. She's beautiful, Marta said softly, gazing at the baby. She looks so peaceful. Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with pride. She is. And she's mine. I'm going to take care of her. I won't make the same mistakes again. Marta sat down beside Sarah, feeling a deep sense of peace. She knew it wouldn't always be easy for Sarah, but she also knew that she was ready. Sarah had a chance to rebuild her life, to make things right, and Marta had been there to help her get this far. You're doing great, Marta said. I know you can do this. They sat there for a while, watching the baby sleep. The room was quiet, but it felt full of hope. Sarah was starting a new chapter in her life, and Marta was glad she could be a part of it. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Sarah was no longer alone. She had a daughter to care for and a future to build. As Marta stood to leave, she turned to Sarah one last time. Take care of her, she said with a smile. I will, Sarah promised. Thank you for everything. Marta walked out of the apartment, feeling a sense of contentment. She had helped someone who needed it, and now a mother and her child were starting a new life together. Sometimes that was all it took. One small act of kindness to change a life forever.